Thank you. And just to briefly introduce myself, since unfortunately I couldn't be here yesterday with you all. So my name is Dunja Dujanovic, and I work in the Emergency and Resilience section, or rather office, within FAO. So just to explain that this is a bit the perspective of what I'm presenting here today. So dealing with food crisis from an agriculture perspective. And the other introductory remark I wanted to make in terms of what this presentation is going to be about. So certainly I will be mentioning some innovative interventions and types of solutions that we are promoting. However, also this very important point that innovation, and it is in the concept note of the workshop, I was glad to read that. Innovation is not always about introducing new science and new technologies and new tools. It's also about changing some of the ways that things have been working so far and identifying how to do that. Hopefully this presentation will speak a little bit from that angle as well. Don't want to repeat anything that was presented yesterday, so I'll quickly rush through this, but important to set this scene in terms of levels of acute food insecurity and what is happening with that. So these are the trends, and the latest figure that was released just recently by the Global Report on Food Crisis is that there are 258 million people in the world who are acutely food insecure, or rather, to be technically precise, who are in crisis or worse levels of acute food insecurity as per the integrated phase classification, of whom there are 35 million people in emergency levels of acute food insecurity, and over 300,000 people in catastrophe levels of food insecurity, which is essentially famine, but famine is declared only when it surpasses certain thresholds in terms of population distribution. So you can see the trend over the past years has been significantly increasing. And in terms of the reasons why, these have been addressed throughout even some of the presentations today, and I'm sure yesterday as well, so no need to repeat. But of course, conflict and insecurity, economic shocks in particular over the past years, as you have seen that sharp increase even just over the past 2 years in terms of the effects of the international shocks of COVID and the Ukraine crisis on food prices, food access, and what that has generated in terms of acute hunger, and of course climate and weather extremes. Now, connecting that a little bit to how the system is dealing with these trends and these crises. So these are the same numbers that were shown before in terms of the acute hunger trends. And above this, you can see the line, a corresponding line of humanitarian finance needs overall, which, as you have seen, have basically doubled in a space of a very few years since 2016. So this is the situation that we're facing, and most of you working in food security will know well in terms of global advocacy the issues and the calls that we're facing around the unsustainability of these trends. And this is pushing us all to reconsider and try to understand how to do things differently. And how to try and curb and reverse the trends that we are seeing. This is the breakdown of those figures for the food security sector, for the food sector specifically, in terms of humanitarian assistance on the left, and in terms of development assistance on the right, in terms of its distribution between the major types of interventions, so food assistance, agriculture and livelihoods, and nutrition, and then obviously in development assistance we have other elements. Where this becomes particularly interesting to consider is in relation to protracted crises. So protracted crises are a conundrum because, as the name says, it's in most cases very long protracted situations of food insecurity where different shocks are compounding and adding on pre-existing chronic vulnerabilities. What is happening in these situations, because these are obviously chronic problems and development problems, the system is not addressing that, or the question is, to what extent is the system addressing that through appropriate measures? What the bar graphs show you is the proportion of humanitarian versus development assistance in those contexts, and you can see that humanitarian assistance dwarfs the development investments in protracted context. And below are pie charts showing the distribution also within that humanitarian assistance between food assistance, between agriculture and then nutrition. So this slide itself poses some questions around how well are we as a system actually addressing the root causes of hunger, which is what we should be doing to have a hope of resolving protracted crises. And just a reminder that protracted crises account for the vast majority of acute hunger in the world today, and that these trends are set to continue in view of the fact that of the multiple drivers of hunger that are interrelating in this context, so between conflict and climate and economic shock. So taking it from the perspective of agriculture, for example, this is very, very interesting for us because agriculture plays a role in development. It also plays a role in humanitarian assistance. And it's important in the context that we are talking about today because over 2/3 of the most food insecure people in this context depend on agriculture for their survival. This includes also a big proportion of the IDP and refugee population who lost their livelihoods, and their livelihoods used to be agriculture-based. And yet we have this balance in financing from the agriculture perspective in terms of how these large food crises are being addressed. So it poses some questions for us in terms of how, not only how to innovate and bring new solutions to these crises, but also how to do things differently with what is already existing and how to build on what people are already doing, which is in many of these contexts already producing their own food and relying on agriculture, to see and try and use that as an entry point to turn around the hunger trends that we are observing. So in terms of some of the solutions that we want to be discussing, obviously it's not a space for an exhaustive discussion on this, but one of the principles that are really important for us to flag, again, building on what I just said in terms of the role that agriculture can play as life-saving aid, as livelihood-saving aid, is the fact that once livelihoods are eroded, it's really difficult for people to recover and rebuild. So we lose that really important asset base on which they could be building their recovery from shocks which are causing the acute hunger trends that we are seeing. So this is all very relevant when we will be discussing shortly the putting together of different kinds of interventions and different kinds of timeframes of interventions in the perspective of having different outcomes than what is happening in most of these contexts today, where we have quite siloed, right, between short-term and mid-term and longer-term assistance. One concrete example of what I was just mentioning is what happened in Tigray in 2021. Who is familiar with that conflict will know that we had a blockade on humanitarian assistance for a number of months. And during that time, what we found when access was again available and we were able to go in and do assessments is that local farmers had been producing food and produced over 900,000 tons of local food, which was 5 times more than what was entering through humanitarian or commercial needs, and meeting a lot of the food needs of the local population. thanks to some of the seeds and agricultural assistance that was by a variety of partners delivered before the blockade started. So obviously this is taking it from one perspective, which is the agricultural sector, but indicating how in some cases we do have some of these solutions that promote local self-reliance, and that could be part of the solutions that we should be discussing in relation to the trends that we were describing beforehand, but which are currently not prioritized in the existing humanitarian system. Mentioning here the HDP nexus approach, because this is very relevant to everything that we've been mentioning so far. So obviously, when we say innovation is doing things differently, and I think other colleagues mentioned this as well, one big innovation would be to make the HDP nexus work practically and at scale across contexts. Obviously, it's easier to say this than do it, and it would be interesting to have a discussion around what some of the challenges are. But what we are realizing is that the siloed approach to financing from the donor side, but also then determining the siloed approach in terms of activities and investments on the ground are one of the reasons and one of the reasons why we are not able to see results in terms of turning around the trends and curbing acute hunger. So linking up humanitarian assistance with more development investments in protracted crises, contributing to local peace, are all types of interventions which should be systematically interconnected to provide the best mix of context-specific solutions to the vulnerable households, rather than a very siloed approach which we have currently on the ground. In those terms, not going into detail here, but just as an introduction in terms of some of the interventions that I will be highlighting among FAO's portfolio of work. So in emergencies and resilience, in FAO, we are working along 3 main pillars, which we are trying to interlink and complement. So we're trying to put into practice the slide from before, which is linking the evidence bases and the analytical capacities of FAO in food crisis context. So the understanding of food crisis and the drivers and the vulnerabilities. 2 short-term interventions that are meeting the immediate food and nutrition needs of the populations in the short term, but then linking that also to resilience investments. And this is a hugely important element to flag, that we should be, wherever possible, complementing and linking short-term to mid and longer-term interventions from a perspective of offering the populations the means to transform the agri-food systems, the local agri-food systems on which they rely, and exit acute food insecurity sustainably. So in terms of some of the tools, let me just really quickly go through this, not going into much detail, but investing in data and analysis. I think this was mentioned by many colleagues. Here I've just flagged the IPC moving more into real-time data collection, moving more into modeling, and the use of technology, of increasing coverage and granularity of our understanding of acute food insecurity, as well as the Data and Emergencies Hub set up to provide, again, deeper understanding of the risks and shocks and needs that the communities are facing. Anticipatory action, here, no need to go into detail. Bettina from World Hunger Hilfe eloquently explained. We are one of the agencies also really investing and promoting this and working closely with both WHH and WFP in this space. Perhaps just to flag that also from our perspective, sorry, I'll go back to this slide. Now, the tricky part with anticipatory action, just to add it as a comment to what was already said before, is really how does it go to scale? So integrating into the humanitarian program cycle, into government policies and the work of national institutions is key. If I may be allowed, just to go to the last slide. Sorry. Yes, 30 seconds. So final thought slide. Right, so just 3 last thoughts. This was meant to be a little bit to encourage some discussion around it. So how can we be addressing protracted food crisis differently, as addressing them only or mainly through short-term actions will not turn the situation around. We won't curb those trends. And you have seen some examples of some of the countries. For instance, the example I have on here is Somalia, which has had 30 consecutive years of humanitarian appeals, and yet the same situation or even worse than years before. Lack of investments from the donor side that demand comprehensive and linked-up approaches. So this is one, not to kind of, the responsibility is shared, but this certainly drives the situation we have today. And also the need to bring together humanitarian with development and also climate action in protracted context in a more coherent way for better outcome. Thank you very much.